Okay, give me a second and we'll begin. All right, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu Wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ba'd. Without too much review, begin straight away. The text that you see in front of you on the screen, أثر الدلالات اللغوية في التفسير عند الطاهر بن عاشور في كتابه التحرير والتنوير. This is a PhD thesis by Mushrif al-Zahrani. This PhD thesis by Mushrif al-Zahrani. It's actually, the book is actually printed. أثر الدلالات اللغوية في التفسير عند ابن عاشور. The book is actually printed, but I could only find the PDF of the original thesis that was submitted. So that's why you see that the formatting of the text is a little bit screwed up. Unfortunately, there's not anything I can do about that. But like you can see here, there's gaps in the text. But for the most part, it's still readable. So what we want to begin with, yesterday we had been speaking about defining tafsir, and we looked at how Sheikh Musa'id has defined tafsir, and we talked briefly about what is the ramifications of that for Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, because he's defined tafsir in a fashion that is somewhat very specific or narrow, if you like. Therefore, what constitutes usul for tafsir are also going to be similarly narrow. Now, what we want to do here is this author, the reason that we're reading what he has to say is because he's presenting, number one, a different take on tafsir, and also he actually responds to what Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar has said. So if we just look quickly, the definitions that he mentions. So for example, he mentions Abu Hayyan's definition. التفسير علم يبحث فيه عن كيفية النطق بألفاظ القرآن ومدلولاتها وأحكامها الإفرادية والتركيبية ومعانيها التي تحمل عليها حال التركيب وتتمات ذلك. He then goes on to quote other definitions. We won't go through them one by one. I want to actually take a look quickly at Abu Hayyan's definition, because in the earlier passage that we read from Mafhum al-Tafsir by Sheikh Musa'id, you see that he mentions Abu Hayyan's definition, and he also quotes Abu Hayyan's explanation of it. So let's just take a look at how he's explained his definition. فقولنا علم هو جنس يشمل سائر العلوم، وقولنا يبحث فيه عن كيفية النطق بألفاظ القرآن هذا علم القراءات، وقولنا ومدلولاتها أي مدلولات تلك الألفاظ، وهذا علم اللغة الذي يحتاج إليه في هذا العلم. By علم اللغة he means basically the defining the words. This is sometimes referred to as علم متن اللغة as well, particularly amongst the متأخرين. وأحكامها الإفرادية والتركيبية. هذا يشمل علم التصريف وعلم الإعراب وعلم البيان وعلم البديع. وعلم البيان I believe here he means علم المعاني عن علم البيان. Basically علم البلاغة. ومعانيها التي تحمل عليها حال التركيب. ومعانيها التي تحمل عليها حال التركيب شمل بقوله التي تحمل عليها ما دلالته عليه بالحقيقة وما دلالته عليه بالمجاز. I'm sorry, I keep getting distracted because people are entering the room. وما دلالته عليه بالمجاز. إن التركيب قد يقتضي بظاهره شيئا ويسد عن الحمل على الظاهر صاد، فيحتاج لأجل ذلك أن يحمل على غير الظاهر وهو المجاز. وقولنا وتتمات ذلك هو معرفة النسخ وسبب النزول وقصة توضح من بهم من في القرآن meaning المبهم ونحو ذلك. So this is his explanation of his definition. So just looking at it again quickly. علم يبحث فيه عن كيفية النطق بألفاظ القرآن. So we're looking at how the words of the Quran are pronounced, which is ilm al-qira'at, the meanings of said words, the ahkam of those words, حالة الإفراد وحالة التركيب, and that includes التشريف, grammar, the various furu of balagha, معانيها التي تحمل عليها حالة التركيب, حقيقة مجاز, وتتمات ذلك, and some other matters that you mentioned that are all related to the maani of the words of the Quran. Because this is basically how he has defined tafsir. And you may recall from your reading that Sheikh Musaid takes exception to this definition because he feels that he has included in it too many things that are inappropriate, meaning things that are not directly relevant to tafsir. Okay, so he mentions a number of definitions. Again, you have the file. You can take a look at them and read them one by one. Amongst them is this definition by Abu Hayyan, and also this definition by Ibn Ashur. I want to highlight since we assigned to you to read the discussion from Ibn Ashur. Ibn Ashur says, "اسم للعلم الباحث عن معاني ألفاظ القرآن وما يستفاد منها باختصار أو توسع." And I know that the text looks really messed up here, but that's just from the formatting of the video. Okay, so you'll note here he says, فالملاحظ أن هذه العبارات في حد التفسير بعضها مجمل وبعضها مفصل وهي في التفسير ليست سواء. So each one mentions specific details that are not in the others. And so he highlights that, and he goes on to say, والظاهر من تعريف أبي حيان أنه يقصد إلى كافة العلوم التي تعين على الفهم العميق لكتاب الله عز وجل وبيان دلالاته وأحكامه وبلاغته، سواء منها علم القراءات أو اللغة أو التشريف أو النحو أو البلاغة أو علوم القرآن الأخرى كالناسخ والمنسوخ والأسباب النزول ونحو ذلك، كما نص هو في شرحه لهذا التعريف. We just read that sharh. That sharh is not, he hasn't quoted the sharh here, but we read the sharh from where Sheikh Musaid is quoted. ولا شك أن هذا التعريف الواسع يشمل العلوم المعينة على تحقيق الفهم الدقيق والعميق لكتاب الله عز وجل، إلا أنه لا ينبغي أن يتوهم دخول بعض الدقائق البعيدة عن التفسير كالنكات البلاغية التي لا يستدعيها المقام، والقصص الذي يدخل أرضا في تفسير آية، والتمادي في ذكر الخلافات الفقهية التي لا علاقة لها بتفسير الآية. So he accepts that the premise that there are things that might be mentioned in books of tafsir that are not really tafsir per se, such as when Al-Qurtubi goes off on his long tangents discussing in basically almost entire abwab of fiqh, rather than just the issues that are relevant to understanding the dalala of the ayah التي لا علاقة لها بتفسير الآية. فذلك كله وإن وقع من بعض المفسرين وأصحاب الحواشي لا يقتضيه تعريف أبي حيان. So why is he mentioning this? وقد رأى بعض الدارسين أن مثل هذه التعريفات يدخل من العلوم ما ليس من علم التفسير ومنها ما لا يدخل كله في مصطلح التفسير. And again, because of the PDF, you'll see that the formatting of the footnotes is, you've got this this garbled symbols. التفسير اللغوي للقرآن الكريم. التفسير اللغوي للقرآن الكريم is, as I've mentioned to you earlier today in the group, this is Sheikh Musaid's PhD thesis. So this is another place where he has mentioned this his conception of tafsir. So this is an idea that he has been developing and has really sort of doubled down on, going back to very early in his academic career. So he refers to Sheikh Musa'id here. قد رأى بعض الدارسين أن مثل هذه التعريفات يدخل من العلوم ما yes okay, going on إلا أن تعبير أبي حيان في تعريفه ورجوع الضمير فيه إلى ألفاظ القرآن دال على أن المقصود من هذه العلوم والقدر المعين على فهمها بالصورة الواسعة والعميقة التي أشار إليها أبو حيان وإخراج القدر الذي لا علاقة له بهذا الفهم. Okay, I think this is clear so far, right? So basically he's saying is that what is intended is to utilize these ulum for the purpose of clarifying the dalalat of the Quran. Here is the point that is particularly I wanted to share, because this is relevant to the definition of Ibn Ashur, and it comes back to what we've been discussing with the definition of Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyar. He says, ويستفاد من تعريف ابن عاشور للتفسير خصوصا قوله باختصار أو توسع أن لعلم التفسير مستويين. الأول وهو ما يمكن أن يسمى بالحد الأدنى من البيان، وهو رفع الإشكال عن معنى اللفظة القرآنية أو الترقيب القرآني، وهذا البيان قد يتحقق This passage now that he's quoting, this is actually a quote from Tafsir al-Lughawi of Sheikh Musa'id. So basically what he's doing is he's saying that what Sheikh Musa'id is called al-Tafsir, and everything else he excludes from Tafsir that doesn't fit inside these parameters, that this is al-mustawa al-adna, this is al-hadd al-adna min al-bayan, and so this is one mustawa of Tafsir. قد يتحقق بمعرفة اللفظة الغريبة في الآية أو بمعرفة قصتها وسبب نزولها أو بمعرفة مكان نزولها وفي من نزلت أو بمعرفة ما فيها من النسخ بمصطلحه العام كبيان مجمل وتخصيص عام وتقييد مطلق ورفع حكم شرعي وغيرها مما يعتريه إزالة ورفع، والمقصود أن ما يقع به بيان عن معنى الآية فإنه تفسير للقرآن. By the way, I should note here that he makes this point about النسخ بمصطلحه العام. He's quoting Sheikh Musa'id. Sheikh Musa'id here is referring to the fact that النسخ, when you see it in the ibarat of the Salaf, particularly the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, doesn't mean naskh in the istilahi sense that we've come to be accustomed to in discussions of fiqh and usul al-fiqh, that this is raf'u hukm bi hukm mutaakhir. So you have one hukm is then being replaced by another hukm. An-naskh in the mustalah, in the urf of the Salaf, means anytime you have two texts where one text qualifies the understanding of another text. And so that includes all of these categories that is mentioned, bayanu mujmal, takhsis am, taqyid mutlaq, and it also includes the istilahi sense of prophet. This, by the way, is an important point to be aware of when dealing with, in the books of tafsir, you're going to find a lot of things where people are saying, oh, this is mansukh, and you have, that ayat to safe has abrogated hundreds of ayat. A lot of these confusions over what is mansukh and what is not mansukh in the Quran actually comes back to the fact that some of these original statements that were made with this meaning intended. They were made with the intent of this meaning of naskh, and so then later on other scholars have interpreted to mean naskh in the technical fiqhi sense, and so then they have misinterpreted, and then this is being presented in much of the tafsir literature as a qawl in tafsir that this verse is actually abrogated, when in fact the original qa'il might not have intended whatsoever that the verse is abrogated. He intended that this is understood in light of this. So this is al-hadd al-adna min al-bayan fi tafsir. Then you have at-tawassu'. So Sheikh Ibn Ashur himself has mentioned this, because remember Sheikh Ibn Ashur in his definition, let's take a look at his definition again. اسم للعلم الباحث عن معاني ألفاظ القرآن وما يستفاد منها باختصار أو توسع. So he is describing التفسير as an ilm that is, established and has its established conventions and literature. And if you look at the tafsir literature, you will find that that some tafsirs that they tend to be very mukhtasar, and oftentimes they do focus on mainly on this what he calls al-hadd al-adna min al-bayan, and others to various extent will add to that, or almost all of them will add to that some deeper exploration, but the shorter ones will tend to add less, and the larger tafsirs oftentimes add more. So al-Thani, he described, this is az-Zahrani now explaining in his own words what Sheikh Ibn Ashur means. الثاني التوسع في بيان مرامي القرآن ومقاصده الفقهية والتربوية والكشف عن وجوه بيانه وتصاريف معانيه وضروب إعجازه، وهي مهايع سلكها المفسرون، فمستقل ومستكثر، إلا أنهم يشتركون على اختلافهم في قدر منها، سواء التفسيرات المختصرة أو المطولة. وهذا المستوى, the second مستوى, which is going deeper into exploring the دلالات, basically you could say are secondary levels of دلالات. هذا المستوى فضلة من وجه وضرورة من وجه آخر. فهو فضلة بالنسبة إلى المبتدئ المقتصد، وضرورة للمتمعن المجتهد، والمستنبط لدلالات القرآن وإيحاءاته العلمية والفقهية والتربوية وغيرها. In any case, he goes on to say that basically the benefit of this taqsim is understanding that that the ulum of, because his PhD thesis is dealing basically with tafsir lughawi in the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, just as Sheikh Musa'id's tafsir is also his PhD thesis was also dealing with basically tafsir lughawi, although he didn't confine himself to looking at a particular tafsir. So he basically here he says the benefit of this is that it shows, when you look at the definition of tafsir, the way that Ibn Ashur has defined it here, it shows that the secondary level of exploring the subtle connotations of the Arabic text and the secondary layer of meanings, that because all of this is also part of tafsir, and much of it is reliant on ulum al-lugha. So therefore this shows that ulum al-lugha, therefore, and the dalalat that are taken from ulum al-lugha are also part of tafsir. So he felt that he has to explain that, because he is then going to build his thesis on studying tafsir lughawi. The actual title is أثر الدلالات اللغوية في التفسير عند الطاهر بن عاشور. So he's going to be studying how this concept of tafsir lughawi, how Ibn Ashur has employed it in his tafsir. But first he wanted to establish this is indeed part of tafsir, because in this other thesis on the topic of tafsir al-lughawi, basically Sheikh Musa'id is arguing that much of this would not actually be tafsir. And so I think to be fair to Sheikh Musa'id, it can be said in his defense that to an extent the difference on this is semantics, and I think he makes a valuable point in saying that there are actually these different levels of engaging with the text, and oftentimes when you're looking at deriving secondary meanings, and this is a point that he's made in a couple of the places that we read, that when you're looking at deriving additional meanings, what he basically calls istinbat, that for the istinbat to be correct, for the large part, the meaning that you have determined to be the meaning of the verse, basically the general gist of the verse, where there is perhaps 2 or 3 different aqwal. I mean, Sheikh Musa'id very clearly he agrees that for example, for exploring the ijaz of the Quran and the subtle dalalat balaghiyya of the Quran, you would use ilm al-balagha. That just is not part of tafsir for him. But obviously that is what you would use it for. So it doesn't. So it, to a considerable extent, the you could say that the difference here is semantics. But again, if we're establishing a science for the purpose of laying out a framework for dealing with tafsir, it's fine for Sheikh Musa'ad to have his own mustalah if he chooses. Problem is that he insists that this is the correct mustalah. And the reality is that this is, number one, it's not reflected by the tafsir literature. So this is his own mustalah. This is not actually the mustalah of the bulk of the mufassirin. When they themselves are doing tafsir, this is obviously, this is their field, this is their discipline. This is how they understand tafsir, then this is what tafsir should be understood as being. Now, if somebody else wants to say, well, I personally choose to use a different mustalah, that's fine. But the problem then becomes that when you're analyzing what they're doing and how they're understanding in light of your mustalah, this is a problem. This is a problem with what he's saying. Second thing is that if this is not the job of the mufassir, exploring these dalalat, these additional layers of dalalat, if this is not the job of the mufassir, whose job is it? What is the genre that exists to explore these dalalat? The reality is that these dalalat are explored in the genre of tafsir. Whether you choose to call it tafsir or call it something, or call it istinbat, fine, that's not a big deal. But there's not a separate genre devoted to exploring this that is separate from the genre of tafsir, where you have works of tafsir that are dedicated to this first level of exposition of the text, and then separate works of tafsir that are dedicated, that are entirely separate genre, that are dedicated to the second level. Now it's true. So the definition that Sheikh Ibn Ashur has given accounts for this, that you have two levels of exploration of the text. One is at the surface level of, I do not know what this text is saying. Someone tell me what this is saying. Either because there are words in it or expressions in it that I don't know what they mean, or there's more than one interpretation and these are contradictory interpretations, and so therefore I don't know which one it is. So at that level, I need explanation. So that is, one mustawa of tafsir. That is one mustawa of tafsir, and that has its place. And there are works of tafsir that, yes, it's true, they focused on this. But even the short tafsirs, as Zahrani points out, are not absent of some of these subtle istinbatat. And as the literature developed over time, as the genre developed over time, they built on what came before them and added to what came before them. And so you will find that, particularly the major tafsir works inevitably are going to add deductions to what has come before them. Okay, so now let's just jump ahead to Sheikh Ibn Ashur has to say. Okay, we want to take a look quickly at what Sheikh Ibn Ashur discusses here about the definition of tafsir. Tafsir, he talks about the linguistic meaning of fasr, and he has a lengthy discussion here, which is actually very nice. I would actually like to go through it, but I don't think that the time will allow. He talks about fa'ala, the wazn of fa'ala, and how it gives the dalala of takfir, and that when you are dealing with a word that is basically you have verbs that are lazim and verbs that are muta'addi. If you take a verb that is lazim and then put it in the fa'ala pattern, it then becomes muta'addi. But if the verb is in its default form already muta'addi, then the dalala that it takes from being put in fa'ala is takthir. And so then he discusses, well, what about verbs that are lazim and have become muta'addi by being put in the fa'ala form? Because you can, like for example, he uses the example of nazala. Nazala is lazim. Anzala is muta'addi. Nazzala is also muta'addi. So he talks about this. He says, well, since fa'ala here is being used for the meaning of ta'diyah, does it also give the meaning of takthir or not? And so he has a very interesting discussion on that. And again, this shows how al-musarf is going to come in to play with how you interpret the Quran. And so, for example, he mentions, he talks about how Imam al-Zamakhshari has, wherever nazzala comes up, he has used the term nazzala. He's understood it with regards to the Quran, that it is referring, because he's adding to it the meaning of takthir. He's understood it to refer to the Quran being revealed gradually in pieces over 23 years. So this gradual revelation, he's taking that meaning from the use of nazzala with the Quran, whereas anzala is being used for the other books that were given to the Bani Israel. Sheikh Ibn Ashur doesn't actually agree with that interpretation, because he actually argues in his tafsir that all of the past books were revealed gradually, so there's no difference between the Quran and other books in that respect. Now, there are objections that are made to this. For example, and I don't really want to get into detail with tafsir, but like for example, Allah says, "Lawla nuzzila alayhi al-Qur'anu jumlatan wahida." Lawla nuzzila alayhi al-Qur'anu jumlatan wahida. So some of them, they point out, well, some of them objected to what the Zamakhshari said. They said that, well, if nazzala indicates takthir, then وَلَوْلَا نُزِّلَ عَلَيْهِ الْقُرْآنُ جُمْلَةً وَاحِدَةً is contradictory, because they're asking, why is the Quran not all sent down at once? So clearly here, nuzzila does not indicate the gradual revelation, the multiple instances of revelation. That's a discussion to be had, but there's actually a response to that. Like for example, Abu Saud, Imam Abu Saud, in his tafsir, he actually says that, first, for starters, as a Zamakhshari himself, because he's not unaware of this problem, because he explained the whole Quran. When he comes to, because he's been using this qaida throughout, when he comes here, he says that here, nuzila is with the meaning of unzila. It's the same meaning. So the ifada of takthir doesn't have to be that in all places has the same meaning, that the word actually has the same meaning. But this is a nukta balaghiya that is taken from looking at, is there a maqsad behind the mutakallim baligh using this expression? And so here you'll see that in the discussion, one of the qaidas that Sheikh Ibn Ashur uses, and this is a very fundamental principle of ilm al-balagha, is that if the mutakallim is baligh, when you have a mutakallim who is eloquent, has a mastery of the Arabic language, is eloquent in the Arabic language, he will not leave the default usage for an alternate usage except for a nukta. So where you can discover what that nukta is, alhamdulillah, and in other cases there might not be a nukta. But with the Quran in particular, because the Quran in its fasaha and its balagha is beyond normal speech, there's going to be much more of this than there is in ordinary speech. An ordinary speaker, even if he's believed, may or may not take these things into account sometimes when he's using something, but oftentimes he will. But the Quran is going to be at a higher level. So with this example, this is one of the important examples that is used as an objection to Az-Zamakhshari's Tafsir. Abu Sa'ud actually has a good response. He says that here, the takthir is not from takthir al-wuqu', that you're having frequent occurrences of revelation. What is intended is kathra in the munazzal, that rather than sending small pieces down, all those pieces send them down. Send them all down together. So the takthir is in what is being sent down, not in the frequency of the occurrence. Which is, I think, it's a reasonable response. Again, my intent here is not to actually get into a tafsir discussion. It's not to get into an actual tafsir discussion. What is the correct tafsir of this? There are other verses that are used as objections to this point. But you see here how the sarf, how it plays a very important role. Another example of this, this is actually something that I heard from Sheikh Hatim. Sheikh Hatim was my teacher. إن في ذلك لآيات لكل صبار شكور. Allah says this a number of times. إن في ذلك لآيات لكل صبار شكور. If somebody can remember the surah. The fa'al pattern is usually used to indicate, it's usually used to indicate frequency of doing a particular action. Whereas the fa'ul pattern also basically indicates mubalagha, but it indicates the azama of that attribute. And so so Sheikh Hatim mentioned that, one time he was in his class, he was explaining the role of these ozan in giving meanings. And so I think either someone asked him about these verses or is reflecting on these verses after he had been discussing this. And so he started pondering, well, what is the reason for this being used? إن في ذلك لآيات لكل صبار شكور, as opposed to إن في ذلك لآيات لكل شكار صبور. Because it could have been that way. So he pondered and he said that the conclusion that he came to was the wisdom of wording it this way is that you'll be tried again and again in your life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you certain tests. And then the time of those tests, you have to be patient. So this is a recurring thing. But as for Allah's blessings, they are something that is constant. There's something that is constant and continuous without break. Even when you are being tested, even when you're being tested severely, even at that time, the blessings that you are enjoying from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are greater. So there will never be a point at which you are without the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it wasn't appropriate, therefore, then to mention shakkar. It was better to say shakur, because shakur indicates the azama of the greatness of that gratitude, as opposed to the recurrence of it. Because you would recur when you receive a blessing, but you're always enjoying a blessing. As opposed to sabbar. Sabbar, that's appropriate, because the tests, tribulations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send your way, they're not continuous. They're not all the time. They happen, and then they pass, and then another one comes after some time. So yes, every time it comes, you have a renewed instance of sabr. But the shukr is continuous without break. So there's a nukta, and this is if we consider what is the purpose of the Quran. The purpose of the Quran is to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no doubt that realizing this meaning, which is a subtle dalala that is being taken from the wazn of the kalimat, rather than just a general understanding of the meanings. This is a meaning that if someone understands it and then they actualize it, this is something that will no doubt bring them closer to Allah. It will increase their guidance. And the Quran was revealed as a book of guidance. So there's no doubt that that these sorts of dalalat are a fundamental part of discovering these sorts of dalalat, explaining these sorts of dalalat is a fundamental part of the role of mufassir. In any case, he gives the definition of tafsir that we discussed. Shaykh ibn Ashur gives the definition of tafsir that we've already discussed. هو اسم العلم الباحث عن بيان معاني ألفاظ القرآن وما يستفاد منها باختصار وتوسع. But as he's discussing this, he then raises what, when I first read it, and for a long time, I found it to be a very strange problem. And to be honest with you, even now I find it a bit odd. But he then explores how is tafsir an ilm. هذا وفي عد التفسير علما تسامح. Saying that technically speaking, tafsir is not really an ilm. It's not really an ilm. And if we call it an ilm, it's ala wajh at-tasamuh, because the technical meaning of the ilm is not, of science, is not really applicable here. And I don't want to go into too much detail into what exactly he means by that. But basically, he's saying that in the ulum aqliya, in the rational sciences, that ilm is applied to a science where you have qadaya kulliya. You have these universal principles that are then established by evidence. And so this is his conception of what a proper ilm is. And this doesn't really apply to tafsir. And so then when he discusses what is tafsir, he says that if you look at tafsir, tafsir is basically you're looking at individual texts, explaining that this is what this text means. This is not a science, meaning it's not an overarching theory that has these fundamental principles. It is an explanation of the meanings of words. He then goes on to defend that it can be called an ilm, and basically he comes to a couple of things that he says that in reality, if we look at it, his fourth explanation, he gives actually a list of 6 possible explanations. The fourth one, he says, العلم التفسير لا يخلو من قواعد كلية في أثنائه مثل تقرير قواعد النسخ وتقرير قواعد التأويل وقواعد المحكم. So it says that there are qawaid in tafsir. As you're going through tafsir, you do deal with qawaid. And his 6th explanation he gives, and he says, هو الفصل. This is the one that he favors. He says, التفسير كان أول من اشتغل به كان أول ما اشتغل به علماء الإسلام قبل الاشتغال بتدوين بقية العلوم وفيه كثرة مناظراتهم وكان يحصل من مزاولته والدربة فيه لصاحبه ملكة يدرك بها أساليب القرآن ودقائق نظمه فكان بذلك مفيدا علوما كلية لها مزيد اختصاص بالقرآن المجيد فمن أجل ذلك سمي علما. So basically he says that this is the most important topic that the ulama of Islam studied, and by their studying it and engaging with it and pondering it, this is the path through which they gained a lot of ulum, and the rest of the ulum come back to it. So in that sense, because it's the asl of it's the foundation from which the rest of the his conclusion is that it's an ilm, but that it's an ilm in this sense, not in the technical sense. It can be called an ilm because it is the asl of the rest of the ulum shari'iyah. The rest of the ulum shari'iyah come from understanding the Quran. Now, I think what's Now, I think that this problem, the answer to it is actually much simpler than that. The answer to it is that an ilm is just a discipline that has its own it's a genre that has its own well-defined parameters in terms of its subject that is studied. I mean, that's it. So I don't think that, and obviously this is the term is used that way for a host of things that might be called ulum, even though that they might not be rational sciences. Their nature might differ considerably. That's not really a problem, and I'm not really that concerned with this issue. However, what I do find interesting here is that when he talks about it, he says that tafsir is not a collection of, does not have a collection of qawaid kulliyah that all of its juz'iyat come back to these qawaid kulliyah. And he says that if we were to count tafsir as an ilm, then explaining poetry should also be an ilm. I would say, okay, fine, I don't have a problem with that. But he's saying it's not a science. It's not a science. When you're explaining poetry, what are you doing? You have certain sciences that are already well established, and you're using them. You're applying them to this text. So you have various linguistic sciences, and you're applying them to this text. You have, with the case of the Qur'an, you have these various linguistic sciences, possibly other sciences, and you're applying them to the text. And so, I think for Sheikh Musa'id, what he would say is that Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, tafsir does not have independent usul. That the Uṣūl al-Tafsīr are basically these other ulum, and they're already existing ulum. You don't need usul. You don't need you don't need a science called Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, because the usul on which tafsir is based already exist in these other sciences. So balagha is from those usul, and Sheikh Ashur actually has a commentary. He has a manual an introductory manual that he wrote on balagha. He also has an unpublished commentary on Dalal al-Ijaz of Al-Qahir al-Jurjani. I think he also has a commentary on Asrar al-Balagha. I'm not sure now, but he wrote commentaries on both, and these are as of yet unpublished. So he has a commentary in this science. He has commentaries in Usul al-Fiqh. He actually published. He published collections of poetry, studied poetry. So he was involved in all of the linguistic sciences at their highest level. So, this question of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, and developing the science of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, as I said, this is all a relatively modern discussion. So if we want to look at, well, okay, how did classical scholars answer this question? We have all the way up to Sheikh Ibn Ashur, who was a relatively modern figure. He died in 1971 or 73. I think he was about 93 years old. He died in 1973. I don't remember the exact date. So he's a relatively modern scholar, but he's definitely continuation of that classical trend, that the scholars had a conception of how tafsir works. And if you read the discussion from Sheikh Musa'id on the history of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, he says that a lot of the Uṣūl of Tafsir is developing, classically it was developing not in independent works devoted to Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, but in various sorts of works. And amongst the important ones that he highlights is the muqaddimat of the books of tafsir. So many mufassirin, when they write a tafsir, in the beginning of the tafsir, they will lay out their conception or some principles or some concept, some idea that they have, some important ideas that they have about tafsir. So you find this going back all the way to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, who wrote his tafsir and he died in the year 150 or thereabouts. There's some dispute over his death, but died around the year 150, the same year that Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi died. So he's a very early scholar, wrote one of the first complete tafsirs. He actually has an introduction, a sort of a theoretical introduction to this tafsir. Al-Tabari has a lengthy introduction which he discusses a host of topics, amongst which he discusses how is tafsir done. And so he says that, I'm going to summarize very simply. He says that there are certain things, the explanation of which is dependent on the explanation of the Prophet ﷺ in the Qur'an. And that would be a lot of the ahkam that are mujmal in the Qur'an, mustalahat that are mujmal in the Qur'an and have been defined by the Sharia. Aside from that, there are things that are the details of which are known only to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like the signs of the hour and when it will come, and certain things that are matters of ghaib that even the Prophet ﷺ did not know. And aside from that, you have things that are known from the Lughah. This is according to to Imam Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Ibn Ashur, also in his, he has a very important introduction. Abu Hayyan has an important introduction. Many mufassirin have important introductions to their tafsir. By the way, most of these important mufassirin who have introductions to their tafsir, most of these muqaddimat, these introductions to these tafsir, Sheikh Musa'id al-Tayyaf, starting from Muqatil ibn Sulaiman down all the way to Ibn Ashur, Sheikh Musa'id has actually done commentaries explaining all of these muqaddimat. So his contribution to this field is considerable. So now, maybe some of you are thinking that, okay, what the heck? We signed up for a course on Uṣūl al-Tafsīr and paid all this money, and now you're telling us, there is no Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Where's our refund? And to those who might be thinking that, it's like just hold your horses. There's more to the discussion than just this. So in any case, moving on from here, the next section that I wanted to share, and we're not really going to go through it because again, there's not the time for that. Sheikh Ibn Ashur, he then discusses istimdad ilm al-tafsir. So by istimdad ilm al-tafsir, he means istimdad al-ilm yuradu bihi tawaqqufuhu على معلومات سابق وجودها على وجود ذلك العلم عند مدونيه لتكون عونا لهم على إتقان تدوين ذلك العلم. So basically, there are certain sciences on which this science is dependent. So the practice of tafsir is dependent on certain sciences. And so he lists them. His list that he gives is ilm al-Arabiya, which later on he explains that for him ilm al-Arabiya includes all of the sciences of the Arabic language. Ilm al-Athar, which includes hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, as well as athar from the companions, as well as narrations of Asbab al-Nuzul, Akhbar al-Arab, because that provides historical context. Usul al-Fiqh. So for him, Usul al-Fiqh is a tool of the Mufassir. Basically, he's saying these are the tools of the Mufassir. These are the tools of the Mufassir. And I would largely agree with him that these are the tools of the Mufassir. So for example, when we look at Usul al-Fiqh, which you mentioned, you have in Usul al-Fiqh all of the mabahith of dilalat al-alfaz, khas and am, etc. And even you have certain principles that are very particular, that are the relevance to tafsir is immediately obvious. Like for example, the qaida al-ibra bi umum al-lafz la bi khusus al-sabab. قاعدة that is built on that قاعدة دخول سورة السبب في العموم بالقطع. That when you do, if you do تخصيص of a general text, that you cannot exclude from it the surah of the sabab al-nuzul. Even to the extent that the books of Usul al-Fiqh explored the issue هل يجوز إحداث تأويل جديد? Is it permissible to introduce a new interpretation of a text? Particularly, ayat of the Qur'an, but also hadiths. Is it permissible to introduce a new ta'wil, a new interpretation? Obviously, the relevance of that tafsir is immediately quite obvious. So there's not that all of usul al-fiqh is necessarily relevant to tafsir, but certainly these mabahid of dalalat al-alfaz, their relevance is, I think, it's quite obvious. So you have usul al-fiqh. He talks about the Arabic language. I think how obvious that is something we've discussed before. A number of ulama have mentioned this, have mentioned the importance of the Arabic language. So, for example, Imam Ibn Atiyya in the introduction to his tafsir, he says, إعراب القرآن أصل في الشريعة لأن بذلك تقوم معانيه التي هي الشرع. The إعراب of the Quran is the foundation of the Sharia because it is necessary for knowing, establishing the meanings of the Quran. As-Samin al-Halabi in the introduction to his tafsir, which is largely a tafsir focusing on i'rab of the Quran, he says, he lists what he feels are the most important sciences for the one who wants to understand the Quran. He says, ilm al-i'rab, ilm al-tasrif, ilm al-lugha. Ilm al-lugha means definitions of words. Ilm al-ma'ani and ilm al-bayan. ورأيت أن هذه العلوم الخمسة متجاذبة شديدة الاتصال بعضها ببعض لا يحصل للناظر في بعضها كبير فائدة بدون الاطلاع على باقيها فإن من عرف كون إلى آخر كلامه. In fact, Ibn Atiyya goes even further. He says, كتاب الله تعالى لا يتفسر إلا بتصريف جميع العلوم فيه. Again, this is also from his introduction. كتاب الله تعالى لا يتفسر إلا بتصريف جميع العلوم فيه. Says that the Quran cannot be explained, cannot be interpreted, except by applying all of the sciences to it, by which he means all of the Shar'i and Arabic sciences to it. And I would largely agree with him. I mean, again, that doesn't mean that to study tafsir, you cannot study tafsir until you are Sibawayh in Nahu, and until you are Imam Bukhari in Hadith, and until you are, Imam al-Razi in Usul al-Fiqh. But obviously, being Imam al-Razi in Usul al-Fiqh, obviously, it seems to have served Imam al-Razi pretty well when he was writing his tafsir. So, if you want to be an imam in tafsir, yes, you will need to have imam in some of these ulum, particularly the linguistic ulum. Now, with that said, I want to now come back and sort of reframe this discussion. When we talk about tafsir and usul al-tafsir, what is tafsir, what is usul al-tafsir? I want to just take a look at, well, firstly, what is the Quran? And how are we supposed to approach the Quran? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the Quran is a book of guidance. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is literally how Allah introduces the Quran. It's a book of guidance. إِنَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ يَهْدِي لِلَّتِي هِيَ أَقْوَمُ. Not only is it the guidance, it's the best of guidance. And that guidance is a very nice quote from Ibn Atiyya produces in his introduction from Ja'far al-Sadiq, although the Muhakkik was unable to find this quote anywhere, so Allah alam where he took it from. وقيل لجعفر بن محمد الصادق فيما صار الشعر والخطب يمل ما عُيد منها والقرآن لا يمل. فقال لأن القرآن حجة على أهل الدهر الثاني كما هو حجة على أهل الدهر الأول. So Imam Ibn Atiyah, he comments, فكل طائفة تتلقاه غضا جديدا ولأن كل امرئ في نفسه متاع عاده وفكر فيه تلقى منه في كل مرة علوما غضة وليس هذا كله في الشعر والخطب. The Quran is guidance for all of mankind until the end of time. And so the process of deriving guidance from it is ongoing until the end of time. And so that is part of the role of the Mufassir. And that is guidance for, tazkiyat al-nafs, it's guidance for family relations, it's guidance for society, it is guidance for the dunya, it's guidance for the affairs of the akhirah, it is comprehensive guidance. And so the process of deriving guidance, taking guidance from the Quran, this is an ongoing thing. It does not end. Also, some other very nice quotes that Ibn Atiyah is hijacking the lesson today. These quotes are also from Ibn Atiyah. He quotes Iyas ibn Muawiyah, says, مثل الذين يقرؤون القرآن وهم لا يعلمون تفسيره كمثل قوم جاءهم كتاب من ملكهم ليلا وليس عندهم مصباح فتداخلتهم روعة ولا يدرون ما في الكتاب ومثل الذي يعرف التفسير كمثل رجل جاءهم بمصباح فقرأوا ما في الكتاب. This quote, by the way, this example that he gives. Yep. By the way, Ibn Atiyah al-Qurtubi copies a lot of things from Ibn Atiyah. Ibn Atiyah is one of his major sources. So a lot of things that are mentioned in Ibn Atiyah, you're going to find them. This, some of you might remember, a while back there was a little bit of a controversy, or really a sort of a tempest in a teacup, about which is more important, understanding the Quran or reciting the Quran. And this dichotomy, it's a false dichotomy. The purpose of the Quran is that we're supposed to read it. We're supposed to read it to understand it. That's why it was revealed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, كتاب أنزلناه إليك مبارك يدبروا آياته وليتذكر أولو الألباب. And so this command is a command for everyone. It's a command for the Ammi to take lesson from the mawa'id, the reminders of the Quran, to develop spiritually. This is the purpose of the Quran, which, by the way, Sheikh Hasib is currently also doing a seminar on Tafsir and developing spirituality. So that is very much relevant to what we're talking about. And that sort of thing is very important. Sort of thing is very important because this is the purpose of the Quran. This is the purpose of our reading the Quran, interacting with the Quran. So the Ammi should at least take some lesson from the mu'ad of the Quran and the meanings of the Quran that he's able to understand. And the alim in his tadabbur should be deriving those subtle dilalat, deriving that guidance and providing guidance for others, being a guiding light for others. Ibn Atiyah relates a very nice story. He says, قرأ رجل القرآن على بعض العلماء قال فلما ختمته أردت الرجوع من أوله, meaning he wanted to read it to him again. This is obviously not unlike many people that we have until today. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but someone who was very keen to read the Quran to one teacher and another, and to do itqan of his talaqqi of the Quran. His teacher, he says to him, اتخذت القراءة علي عملا اذهب فاقرأه على الله تعالى في ليلك وانظر ماذا يفهمك منه فاعمل به. This is why the Quran was revealed. I mean, literally, the revelation of the Quran began with يا أيها المزمل قم الليل إلا قليلا نصفه أو انقص منه قليلا أو زد عليه ورتل القرآن ترتيلا. The purpose of the recitation was to recite it, to pray with it, to ponder it, to act on it, to actualize it, to let it purify your heart. And so that process of taking guidance from it has to be ongoing. If it was just, if there was no active involvement with engagement with the meanings of the Quran, number one, we will not be able to discover in it the guidance that is provided for us for new problems that we're facing. And number two, simply the act of engaging with the Quran, that is part of taking benefit from it. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us the Quran is an Arabic text. So for example, He says, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. So He describes it as an Arabic Quran, which means that, you know, its features are, some of its features are features that are distinct to the nature of the Arabic language. And Imam Shatibi in al-Muwafaqat, he actually makes an interesting point. And by the way, for those who are unaware, Imam Shatibi is, in addition to, you know, his famous works al-Muwafaqat and al-I'tisam, he has a massive sharh of Alfiyat ibn Malik. He's also a major scholar of Nahu. So in his al-Muwafaqat, he says that basically the Arabic language has two levels. General dalalat that you can find that will be common to all languages. Basically, all languages are able to express them in relatively straightforward fashion. And then you have dalalat khassa that are that are unique to it. What he means by the dalalat khassa that are unique to it, basically, if you look at the examples that he mentioned, he's basically talking about what is known as ilm al-ma'ani. So ilm al-ma'ani, basically the unique structure of the Arabic, the unique grammatical structure of the Arabic language and Arabic sentences is such that you, from the sentence structure, that is chosen out of a host of options that could have been used, just the way that the sentence is structured will give you certain dilalat. And these dilalat are known through ilm al-ma'ani. And so he says that this is something that is unique to the Quran. There's a host of features that are unique to the Quran due to it or unique to the Arabic language, I should say, and the Quran as an Arabic text. So for example, the phenomenon of ishtiqaq, where you have roots and you derive from those roots various words by going through different forms. Dr. Muhammad Hassan Jabal, in his introduction to Al-Mu'jam al-Ishtiqaqi, he mentions that there are something like 400 different siyagh, 400 different morphological forms that words can take from in the Arabic language. And so this gives the Arabic language a richness that is somewhat unique to it. And so as a result of that, the Arabic language, borrowing of foreign words in the Arabic language is far less, and the need for it is far less than in other languages, because there is this built-in ability to create words and create expressions for new meanings that come up. And so as a result of this, the Arabic language is so rich in its meaning, so rich in its ability to express subtle meanings through the structure of the sentences, through the structure of the words. So all of these unique characteristics have to be taken into account when looking at interpreting the Quran. The nature of the Quran as a text, the nature of the Arabic language in which the Quran was revealed. And so if we look at the Quran, and the Quran then being the highest form because it is divine revelation, its composition is coming from someone who is all-knowing, and so therefore is able to maximize the expressive ability of the Quranic text. And so as a result of that, the Quran is very rich and very layered in meaning. There's a narration from Abu Darda. He says, إِنَّكَ لَن تَفْقَهَ كُلَّ الْفِقْهِ حَتَّى تَرَى لِلْقُرْآنِ وُجُوهًا. You will not have attain full, complete fiqh until you can recognize multiple layers of meaning or multiple possible interpretations for the Quran. This isnad for this is munqata', but there's other narrations similar to this that show that at the very least, this idea of the Quran being hammalun du wujuh, as it's sometimes expressed, was already in circulation at least by the time of the Tabi'een, if not the Sahaba. Also, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "U'titu jawami al-kalim." I was given comprehensive speech. This expression, jawami al-kalim, few words that carry great deal of meaning, very potent speech. A number of ulama have actually interpreted this hadith saying that what he's referring to here is the Quran. I know that it's popularly misunderstood to refer to the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ as their jawami al-kalim, but some of the shurrah actually said that it's referring to the Quran itself, because although that description might be true of the words of the Prophet ﷺ, it's more true of the Quran. The Quran then also tells us about itself some other things. It mentions the existence of muhkam and mutashabih. And so, because there are these different layers of meaning, or multiple layers of meaning, or multiple possibilities in the text, but not every single one of those possibilities is correct. And so the muhkam has to be understood in light of the mutashabih. The ayah, the same ayah that mentions وَالَّذِي أَنزَلَ عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ مِنْهُ آيَاتٌ مُحْكَمَاتٌ هُنَّ أُمُّ الْكِتَابِ وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٌ, then goes on to point to the need for specialists, الرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ. So there is a need for specialists who are capable of determining what are correct interpretations, incorrect interpretations, possible interpretations, valid interpretations. Again, reinforcing the idea of the Quran having multiple layers of meaning. Ali radiallahu anhu was asked, هل خصكم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بشيء, alluding to the idea of Ahlul Bayt possibly being given special knowledge that was not given to others. He said, فقال ما عندنا غير ما في هذه الصحيفة. So he had a sahifa in which he had written down some hadiths he had heard from the Prophet ﷺ. أو فهم يؤتاه الرجل في القرآن. It's a hadith reported by Imam al-Bukhari. Or an understanding that a man will be given in the Quran, meaning that this is something that it's fath from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Az-Zurqani comments on this in Sharh al-Muhab al-Dunya. He says that this indicates جواز استخراج العالم من القرآن بفهمه ما لم يكن منقولا عن المفسرين. He mentions the shart إذا وافق أصول الشريعة, which is good. I would say that I would agree with that, and I would add to that the qaid that obviously it has to be within the dalalat of the lugha, as well as consistent with the rest of the usul of the sharia. So just because something is muhtamil in the lugha doesn't mean that it's a valid interpretation until it is at least can be said to be consistent with the usul of the sharia. So Mufassir needs to have an understanding of the usul of the sharia, he needs to have a command of the Arabic language. And as there's a famous athar from Ali, it's reported as a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. Its isnad is weak, but Imam Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, he concludes that it's most likely the words of Ali himself, in which he describes the Quran saying, لا يشبع منه العلماء. The ulama can never get their fill of it. So there are always meanings to be discovered. وَلَا يَخْلَقُ عَنْ كَثْرَةِ الرَّدِّ. And it doesn't get old no matter how much you repeat it, alluding to that idea that we quoted from Ja'far al-Sadiq, or that Ibn Atiyah quoted. وَلَا تَنْقَضِي عَجَائِبُ. And its wonders never cease. And really, the Quran is amazing. Just to illustrate that idea, I wanted to show you guys an example. This is a book. من إعجاز القرآن في أعجمي القرآن وجه في الإعجاز جديد. وجه في إعجاز القرآن جديد, by Mahmoud Raouf Abdul Hamid Abu Sa'da. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. This is a work actually in 2 volumes. This is the first volume. In this work, what he's done is he actually explores how the Quran, whenever it uses proper names that are non-Arabic, many of them being names of the prophets, the Quran will, in the text of the Quran, give some indication of the meaning of that name and how the name has been translated and other subtle dalalat related to that name. And when you read the introduction to his book, and this is my personal impression, and everyone that I know who has read the book has said the same thing. When you read the introduction to the book, you think, this is very far-fetched. The notion that you can take from the siyaq of these ayat that are mentioning these names, actual meaning of the name in the original language and how it's been translated and some other things like that, seems very far-fetched. But he makes a very convincing case throughout the work with the names that he explains that in fact the Quran has done this. So this is just a small example, but genuinely, you know, when Ali here describes the Quran in وَلَا تَنْقَضِي عَجَائِبُ, this is true. وَلَا تَنْقَضِي عَجَائِبُ. So basically, with that said, to wrap things up and bring sort of our discussion to sort of a cohesive conclusion. If we want to talk about tafsir and how does tafsir work, and based on that, you know, what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr? The foundation of tafsir is language, and that includes looking at the various sciences of the language, nahu, sarf, lugha, balagha, etc. As well as the mabahith of dalalat al-alfaz. Because basically the mabahith of dalalat al-alfaz in the books of Usul al-Fiqh are in reality linguistic discussions. So the foundation of the interpretation of Quran is lugha, the language, Arabic language, including looking at the language of the Quran itself and the usloob of the Quran itself, while taking into account the rest of the masadir of tafsir as they've been listed by, you know, someone like Sheikh Musaid al-Tayyar in his at-Tahrir. But one thing that you will note is that even when you're doing tafsir of the Quran, you know, you're doing tafsir of Quran bil Quran or tafsir of Quran bil Sunnah or what have you, that that interpretation cannot cancel the linguistic meaning of the verse. It has to be consistent with the language of the verse. It can qualify what the verse is saying, it could explain what the verse is saying. It cannot cancel what the verse is saying. So the foundation would be to understand the text as an Arabic text, and then to take into account the asbab al-nuzul, then to take into account what other ayat are saying, then to take into account what the Prophet ﷺ is saying, and so forth. Looking at ijma', looking at the principles of the Sharia. There are then some parts of the Quran that require prophetic explanation. And that includes, you know, mainly has to do a lot with the ahkam, because you have a lot of ahkam that are mujmal in the Quran. And then the details and the application of them come in the Sunnah. You have mustalahat shar'iyya in the Quran. So mustalahat shar'iyya are things that have been defined by the Sharia itself. So it's not enough to simply look at them in the lugha. You have to also, although again, the mustalahat shar'iyya, their meaning in the Sharia will not cancel their meaning, in their lughawi meaning, but it will somehow or another qualify the lughawi meaning. Okay, so now if we want to talk about what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, I would say that, you know, the fact that many of these tools that are the tools of the Mufassir already exist in these other sciences is not a problem. These are part of the Usul of Tafsir. So many of the mabahith of Usul al-Fiqh, you find that were reproduced by As-Suyuti and before Zarkashi in al-Burhan and al-Itqan as part of Ulum al-Quran because of their usefulness for tafsir. Likewise, discussions that are coming from Nahu, discussions that are coming from ilm al-balagha also are reproduced by them because they are so pertinent to the mufassir. So the fact that they're being taken from other ulum, I don't see as a problem. I mean, even if you consider Usul al-Fiqh, much of the books of Usul al-Fiqh, any book of Usul al-Fiqh, if you pick it up, much of what it will cover are the dalalat of al-alfaz. There are some other mabahith, there are other important mabahith as well, but so much of it is dalalat al-alfaz. If the mabahith of dalalat al-alfaz have had already been explored by linguists before the genre of Usul al-Fiqh came to be, there would not have been mabahith of books of Usul al-Fiqh. There would have been mabahith of some other genre of linguistics, of ulum al-lugha. But it happens to be the case that they came up in Usul al-Fiqh. So the same way that Usul al-Fiqh, the science of Usul al-Fiqh explored these, if we're going to develop Usul al-Tafsir into its own genre, there's no problem that it's taking from things from sciences that are already existing, or from things that perhaps look like they belong in other places. In fact, consider that when Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, when he wrote Dalail al-I'jaz, which becomes the foundation of ilm al-Ma'ani, he wrote it for the purpose of explaining the I'jaz of the Qur'an. Now, the science that he developed, ilm al-Ma'ani, is then applicable to all other Arabic texts as well. But its very purpose of existence from its initiation was for the purpose of explaining the I'jaz of the Qur'an. So to count these things as part of the Usul of Tafsir is not a problem. If you add to that, there are certain mabahith, certain discussions, certain principles, certain qawa'id that maybe have yet to be explored in any of these other works, and are being explored in dedicated works like discussions on Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, which our good friend and Sheikh Suhaib Saeed, he has his PhD thesis is entirely about Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, what is known as Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, and he goes into to great depth with this. And there are other works that have been written on this in the Arabic language, but I can say, after having read most of his thesis and having read a number of the other books on the topic, that this is by far better than any of the others that have been written. And so, this is a 276 page, that's including bibliography and what have you, but 276 page exploration of tafsir of the Quran through the Quran. This is a method of just one aspect of tafsir. And so there's a lot to be explored that, these discussions of tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, for example, are not found in books of Usul al-Fiqh, for example. You could say that the roots of them are there, perhaps. Certain principles that you would use for tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran might already have, the roots of those ideas might already be there in the books of Usul al-Fiqh or in other works. But there are mabahith, such as Tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, Maqasid al-Sur, and the role of that in tafsir, that still require development and were not developed in any of these other sciences. So there's no problem in my mind to create a genre of Usul al-Tafsir that attempts to explain the relationship of tafsir to all of the rest of the ulum, and explores these theoretical discussions as well that have yet to be mabahith, that have yet to be hammered out and explained. Another one is the role of Isra'iliyat in tafsir, because Isra'iliyat have a very large presence in tafsir, and this has not much has been done to explain it really until a paper that was written by Sheikh Musaid on this topic. So you have a host of issues that have yet to be fleshed out. And this is not surprising. I mean, if you consider that ilm usul al-fiqh is a well-established, well-developed science, a mature science that many of its, the parameters of its discussions and its topics are already well defined and mature and developed. Imam al-Qarrafi, in his book Al-Furuq, he says, إن القواعد ليست مستوعبة في أصول الفقه بل للشريعة قواعد كثيرة جدا عند أئمة الفتوى والفقهاء لا توجد في كتب أصول الفقه أصلا وذلك هو الباعث لي على وضع هذا الكتاب لأضبط تلك القواعد بحسب طاقتي. So even Usul al-Fiqh, which is already a well-established and well-developed science, this great Imam al-Qarrafi is saying that there's still many qawaid of the Sharia that have yet to be properly fleshed out in the works of Usul al-Fiqh, and that I'm attempting to do my part in doing that. And at the end of the day, it's my belief that in reality, the ulum of the Sharia are a single ilm. They're all interconnected. And so, because the mabahith of dalalat al-alfaz, for example, in Usul al-Fiqh, are devoted to what? To interpreting the text of the Qur'an and the Sunnah. Now, there might be for the purpose of deriving ahkam, but nonetheless, many of those qawaid of dalalat al-alfaz are applicable to texts in which there is ahkam, and as well as texts in which there is no ahkam to be derived. But even with that, even with Usul al-Fiqh, it is not enough for the faqih to have studied only Usul al-Fiqh to practice fiqh. He would still need to have studied the rest of the ulum of the lughah. So the fact that there's this interdependence between these ulum, this is not a problem. The fact that I think the ideal in writing out the theory of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr would be to explain where does all of these different ulum fit in their role in tafsir, as well as then fleshing out certain topics that have not been given their due diligence or have yet to be fully developed, even if their development began in other sciences. And so that basically, in a nutshell, I hope that I haven't lost you guys. That in a nutshell is my perspective on what constitutes Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. Okay, basically we can open for questions now. Question and answer if anybody has questions. Yeah, go ahead, Rehan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sheikh. In regards to tafsir, one thing I've noticed, I haven't actually obviously had a very deep sort of overview and reading of all the different tafsir. One thing I have, the question has been on my mind when studying basic parts of it is why, as you said, has Usul al-Fiqh been so deeply kind of and firmed out in regards to the usul of it, in terms of the hierarchy, in terms of how we look at or come to a final conclusion, whereas in Usul al-Tafsir, like you said, there are still many areas like the Israeliyat, where I guess the scholars haven't really written a methodology in regards to it, how to approach it. I was just wondering why that, when obviously tafsir is such an important aspect of our deen.
Well, I think in part the answer to that question lies in going back to the Muqaddimat of Mufassirin. You go back to the Muqaddimat of Mufassirin, you find that they explain what they think how the workings of tafsir are. So, for example, this passage that we read from Ibn Ashur. Ibn Ashur has laid out his theory of how tafsir works, and so he talked about the ulum that are needed when he discussed istibdad and tafsir. Going back further, Ibn Atiyah is even more blunt or bold or whatever. when he says that al-Qur'an كتاب الله لا يتفسر إلا بتصريف جميع العلوم فيه. So that for them is the theory. Theory is learn the sciences and then apply them properly to understanding. And so the theoretical tools that you need are there. And then there are some particular points about sort of putting all of that together that oftentimes they will try and deal with in their introductions to their tafsir. So to them, in their mind, I think that there was that the tools sort of existed, and they sort of had a conception of what they are. And so this, some people that present this question as a question of, how is it possible that all these years that science did not develop for this? And so we've sort of already seen from these scholars, they would have felt that they thought that that Uṣūl al-Fiqh was one of those tools. Okay. They thought that the tools of tafsir, the tools of tafsir include Uṣūl al-Fiqh, and so even when Zarkashi and Suyuti write al-Qur'an and then al-Itqan, you look at a lot of the tools that they give. They're mabahith that are taken from Uṣūl al-Fiqh, mabahith that are taken from al-Balagha, mabahith that are taken from ilm al-Nahu. And so, in addition to discussions that are sort of particular to the Qur'an, so for them, these were, rather than a single science that makes up sort of, I guess you could say, the hermeneutic theory of tafsir. It was a host of sciences. But that doesn't preclude the fact that certain theoretical discussions could not be further developed. And that is in every end. I mean, Uṣūl al-Fiqh, as well developed a science as it is, there's still plenty of holes to be plugged, as Imam al-Qarrafi pointed out. And Imam al-Qarrafi is coming, although, I mean, there's basically 700 years separating us from Imam al-Qarrafi. Anyone who follows the history of the development of the various Islamic ulum will know that not long after the period of Imam al-Qarrafi is the period where it's rare to find original contributions to the ulum. So basically, where someone like al-Qarrafi or maybe even Ash-Shāṭibī stopped in terms of adding to theoretical discussions of Uṣūl al-Fiqh, that the science sort of froze there. But they themselves acknowledge that there are gaps, there are holes here. So, for example, Ash-Shāṭibī, he writes about Maqāsid al-Sharia, and so he's sort of the first one to write in a dedicated fashion to Maqāsid al-Sharia, unless you count Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam in his Qawaid al-Ahkam, because it also deals largely with Maqāsid al-Sharia. And then you have Ash-Shāṭibī. After Ash-Shāṭibī, there's really not anyone coming along developing his ideas or exploring those concepts further. So a lot of things sort of the theoretical development of a lot of sciences, they stopped at a certain point historically. And so Ibn Ashur, incidentally, is the one who comes along and writes the first major modern work on Maqāsid al-Sharia, and it is basically the single most important contribution to the field since Ash-Shāṭibī. And he comes along and he says that yes, Ash-Shāṭibī wrote this work, and there are all these things that he said I don't actually agree with, and therefore I'm going to try and fix some of those errors and plug some of those gaps. So even, and that's with Maqāsid al-Sharia, if you consider it a branch of Uṣūl al-Fiqh. This is a well-developed science. So there's always scope for exploring things further theoretically, and working out the fine points of the of theoretical discussions. But I would say two things. One is that this doesn't mean that scholars who were doing tafsir in the past didn't have a theoretical framework from which they were working. The second thing that I would say is that oftentimes, where there is gaps in the development of certain concepts theoretically, those gaps, oftentimes you tend to not realize them until you need to deal with them. And so some intellectual need arises as a result of which people start saying, hold on, we're saying something is not quite right. So for example, with Ibn Ashur, why is Ibn Ashur in the modern era writing about Maqasid al-Sharia? In fact, we have a whole bunch of people now writing about Maqasid al-Sharia. Why are they writing now about Maqasid al-Sharia? Well, one of the reasons they're writing about Maqasid al-Sharia is that for whatever reasons, a host of scholars felt that there is some sort of fiqh reform that is needed, or facing the challenges in the modern era, they felt a bit lost that this system that we had for fiqh that revolved around the madahib and developed in a certain fashion might have done its job before, but now we're a bit lost. And so, for some scholars, in trying to find answers to these questions, they're starting to say, well, we need to do ijtihad. Well, that requires, usul al-fiqh, that requires maqasid al-sharia. And so then they're starting to re-examine certain things. And so when the fiqh was relatively settled and people were just in practice, they were not going to go outside of a madhab, because really the authority of the madhabs was such that you couldn't really go against the madhab. At that point in time, for example, ijma', hammering out the details of ijma' was not a necessity, because forget about going outside of the ijma'. Nobody was going outside of the four madhabs, which is not even ijma'. So you didn't actually need to know, well, how does ijma' work? Or this theory of ijma' is there holes in it? Does it actually work? Come to the modern era, and you all of a sudden have, various scholars and writers who are saying, wait a second, some of these shurut, they don't seem to make sense. They don't seem to be applicable. How does this work? And so people are now asking questions about it, and writing about it, and debating about it, because an intellectual need arose. In our time, again, we have, the sort of the traditional scholarly authority has sort of broken down. I'm not saying that that's a good thing. It's a fact. This is what has happened. And so now, explanation of the Qur'an is the door is open to everybody. And so you have someone like Shahrur, Muhammad Shahrur, writing books on interpretation of the Qur'an. And he says, for example, and then recently he was doing shows in Ramadan, and he says that al-Fajr here, it means al-Infijar al-Azim, the Big Bang. Why? Just it feels like Fajr means Big Bang. So so all of a sudden, the question arises: well, who can do tafsir, and how is tafsir done, and why is this tafsir wrong, or why is that person's tafsir wrong? This is not that such questions didn't arise in the past. Such questions arose in the past as well, but they were dealt. Scholarly responses would happen. But now, again, the discussion is up in the air, and so people are asking questions that perhaps have not been asked in a long time, or were not asked. Shahrur, the Syrian writer named Shahrur, passed away recently. He says a lot of crazy things. is basically that zina is permissible as long as it's done with consent, and other very strange ideas. I mean, even recently we've seen there was a controversy with some people writing an interpretation of the Quran, writing a commentary on the Quran in English, and interjecting into it very controversial interpretations of certain verses, trying to basically say that other religions are legitimate paths to gaining Allah's pleasure and what have you. And so this again, someone could ask, well, no, why is that interpretation wrong? Why is it not just another interpretation? And so the discussions that are happening, they're new discussions, which, now that you mentioned that, it reminds me that Sheikh Suhaib, Dr. Suhaib, he also has another paper on that, where he looks at a controversy that happened with an Egyptian scholar, Abdul Sabur Shaheen, and a book that he wrote, certain, dealing basically with evolution, human evolution, and the controversy that it created, and what the ramifications of that are for questions of Uṣūl al-Tafsīr. So, I mean, a lot of, in a considerable extent, I think, a lot of the discussions that we're having now are being had simply because people are questioning things that weren't questioned before, rightly or wrongly. And so when those questions are asked, sometimes maybe the answer is there, but it's not a ready, well-packaged answer. We need to dig and find the answer. And so in a lot of cases, much of what we will be discussing in terms of, well, what is Uṣūl al-Tafsīr and how does Tafsir work, simply would involve digging through the books of Tafsir and understanding, well, how did Mufassirin do Tafsir in the first place, and why did they do it that way? What is your view on? Yes, somebody has a question. Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. On the topic of usage of things like Uṣūl al-Tafsīr, Uṣūl al-Fiqh in Tafsir, or in Uṣūl al-Tafsir, are there certain mabahith of, for example, ijma', for example, how far does ijma' go when it comes to interpreting certain ayat, being that, the kalam Allah Azza wa Jal is la nihayata lahu fi ma'anihi wa la nihayata lahu, so how do we make dhabt of ijma' when it comes to certain aqwal and sticking to those aqwal as opposed to exploring other options or other interpretations after the istiqrar of the qawl, or the majority, after the istiqrar of the qawl in the early generations?
Well, that's a good question to ask, and that is an example of a question that scholars are now in the modern era exploring in a fashion that maybe has not been, or in a level of detail that was not necessarily explored before. Because, as I mentioned, there is a classical discussion in the books of Usul al-Fiqh about هل يجوز تأويل إحداث جديد, or إحداث تأويل ثالث, as they say. Which basically means a new opinion, a new interpretation. Can you introduce a new interpretation? And so some ulama say no, and some ulama say yes, but what are the conditions for that? That's a lengthy discussion in and of itself. If you see the book that I've shared with you guys at Tahrir by Sheikh Musa'id, he has a discussion in there where he gives his perspective on Ijma' and Tafsir. Sheikh Hatim, in his book Takween Malakat al-Tafsir, which has been shared with you as well, he has a different perspective on it. This is something that we will, inshallah, come back to and visit this question again later on as we actually go through the different tafsir work. So I don't want to get ahead of myself with that.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
But I mean, I think one thing that could be said is that ijma' is a bit of it's one of the more confusing, problematic topics in the science of Usul al-Fiqh to begin with. And this is even though the science of Usul al-Fiqh is a well-developed science, and and yet the topic of fiqh, the topic of ijma' in fiqh is problematic. Meaning it's not very clear. If you read what all the Usuliyin have said and try and work out, okay, well, so how does ijma' work according to who? It's a very difficult topic. I would argue, perhaps one of the classical topics of usul fiqh, the one that needs the most refinement. And so now we're talking about a topic that has the discussions of it, or at least dedicated discussions of it, that are separate from the books of Usul al-Tafsir, Usul al-Fiqh. These discussions are relatively new. Okay, so what is your view on the Tafsir of Rashid Ridha? There seems to be a new angle in the genre influenced by modernity. Yeah, some of his interpretations you're gonna find are problematic, but on the whole, I would say that Rashid Ridha, in spite of that, he makes a lot of valuable contribution to the field of tafsir as well. But I mean, again, like any other scholar, so there are issues with his tafsir, but that doesn't mean that his tafsir is without benefit. In fact, it's a unique work and a unique contribution to the field in light of the questions raised by modernity. Any other questions, or are we done?
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
So my question is in regards to the definition of tafsir given by Ibn Ashur, where he describes ikhtisar wa tawassu'. So how exactly would Sheikh Tayyar view what Ibn Ashur identifies as tawassu'? Because going back to the doc which you sent in Mafhum al-Qur'an on page 60, when he talks about istinbat, so would that fall under tawassu'?
Yes, that tawassu' would be in the framework of Sheikh Tayyar. That would be istinbat. It would be istinbat or lata'if, balaghiya, or what have you. But it would not be from what he refers to as sulb al-tafsir. Istinbatat amma. I mean, maybe he wouldn't put it here under istinbatat amma, but yes, some of them would be istinbatat amma, some of them would be lata'if. What he calls here lata'if mulah tafsiriyya, which, if you give, as we discussed yesterday, the example that he gave, I found it to be problematic. If this interpretation is correct, although I'm a bit skeptical about it, that ba'atha indicates كانوا موتى باعتقاداتهم فبعث الله لهم النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ليحييهم. Yes, I agree that this is not an essential dilala in the verse, but if that dilala is there in the verse, then as far as I'm concerned, that is part of tafsir. Assuming that this tafsir might be correct or incorrect, but it is part of tafsir as far as I'm concerned. But clearly for Sheikh Musa'id, it's not. So yes, basically what Sheikh Ibn Ashur is calling tawassu', particularly in the way that Az-Zahrani has interpreted it, for the most part would fall in. It is what Sheikh Musa'id has taken to calling ulum al-ayah. These are ulum that are taken from the ayah, but they're not the tafsir of the ayah. They're additional ulum of the ayah. But again, for Sheikh Musa'id, he makes a very important point that in large part, for these istinbatat to be sound at this secondary layer of meaning, you're understanding of the primary meaning of the verse, the general meaning of the verse, must first be sound. Good. Is that everyone?
Assalamu
alaikum.
Okay, so when you're talking about Zamakhshari and discussing balagha and how that's important in understanding certain nukat about the Quran.
Yes.
I mean, it sounds like lugha is independent, or rather it's something that exists, and the qawaid for understanding the Quran or all the tools and asalib are found outside. But is there anything that the Quran came with? I know Ibn Ashur mentioned ikhtira'at al-Quran. Is there anything you can say is specific to the Quran that, you know, he's back in the opposite direction? Like it affected, the Quran affected lugha or something like that? Or has an uslub that's not necessarily found in Shi'run Jahili or something like that?
That's a good question. Obviously, there is, as you pointed out, Sheikh Ibn Ashur talks about what he calls mubtakarat al-Quran. I think sometimes he also uses the expression mukhtara'at al-Quran or ikhtira'at al-Quran, where basically the Quran is basically sort of introducing new things. But again, when it's introducing new things, it's not introducing new things meaning that there's something that is completely alien to the Arabic language. Because the reality is that language is developed. And people, for example, if we look at the idea of majaz, people coin new majazat. People coin new figurative expressions. They create new metaphors. And so, in that sense, yes, the Arabic language does add to the Quran, the Quran does add to the Arabic language. But again, it's building on the Arabic language, adding, creating new expressions, or creating new metaphors, or using new asalib that are within the boundaries of what is possible within the Arabic language. This is something that's possible for the Arabic speaker even before the Quran was revealed. That's how, because all languages are always developing and evolving. So it's not surprising then that the Quran would do that as well. Even the mustalahat shar'iyya are something that the Quran has added. They're not present in the language asalatan. But basically, the mustalahat shar'iyya, they're a type of urf, they're a type of dalala urfiyya, and people develop their own dalalat urfiyya. For example, people in a particular field, when they develop mustalahat for that field, they develop a particular jargon for that, for their specialization. That's an urf khas. And so basically the mustalahat shar'iyya, they're an urf shar'i. So it does very dynamic things in the way that it uses the language, which those could be said to be new. Whether on the level of individual words or expressions. Also, there is another thing, which is that there are certain features that are unique to the Quran as a text. The way that it's organized, the surahs are arranged, even the way that it uses certain expressions, or things that are khas to the Quran. And so you find that ulama have actually studied a lot of these things, and I don't doubt that there is yet things to be explored concerning the language of the Quran. One thing that, for example, Sayyid Qutb talks about is he talks about the imagery of the Quran, how the Quran uses imagery, and he talks about the sound quality of the Quran. That there's oftentimes a sort of connection to the topic of the Quran, that is of a given surah that is being discussed, and the way that the verses of that surah sound. that, I think, in one place maybe discussing Surah Al-Anfal. I don't know if it was Surah Al-Anfal or some other surah. It's talking about, that the sound of the end of the verses recalls something like, I think he said, the beating of the drums of war. I don't know if it was Surah Al-Anfal or Surah Muhammad or something, but he oftentimes explores, the Quran's usage of the language in that way. So there's so many avenues of the way that the Quran uses the language to be explored. That yes, I think it's safe to say that the Quran has unique features. But again, at a fundamental level, the most important tools for analyzing these features are the linguistic sciences, including even say tools of modern linguistics that have not been necessarily explored by classical Arabic scholarship. Not that I'm an expert in those, but I'm saying for the sake of argument that they could also contribute to the analysis of the Quranic text in ways that perhaps have not been considered before. Right. With regards to the definition of tafsir, I think the definitions that we saw, whether the definition of Abu Hayyan or the definition of Ibn Ashur, although they've approached the way that they've defined it in a little bit different ways, I would say both of those definitions are fine. Both of those conceptions, both of those definitions are based on the same conception of what constitutes tafsir. Ibn Ashur's perhaps adds this benefit of taking into consideration that although he doesn't go into some of the details that Abu Hayyan does, he does sort of account his definition. If at least we understand it as Zahrani has understood it, it does account for the fact that there are different levels of engagement with the meanings of the Quranic text. Okay, I think is anybody else? Or all right, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.